Please, can we take a seat? Thank you. Not asking you to leave, just to take a seat. We can start. What do you do? Is there interpretation service? No.
No, she's been around for a while. She's been with us now for 4 years, I guess.
Good afternoon. We're about to start. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to this very important event this evening. As you all know, the Global Stocktake is a central element of the Paris Agreement, intended to ramp up ambition for climate action, including the means of implementation. The outcome of the Global Stocktake shall inform the nationally determined contributions of parties, enabling them to update and enhance their actions and support, as well as through international cooperation and climate action. For the first time, the world is looking back at how much progress has been made towards achieving the global goals of the Paris Agreement, what the gaps are, what corrective measures will be needed, and how fast we need to implement these corrective measures. This first Global Stocktake is very significant. It will be one of the key outcomes of COP28 in Abu Dhabi. As a matter of fact, some people are already calling COP28 the Global Stocktake COP. At COP28, this process of retrospection will culminate in a momentum for increased ambition and to inject new energy in the process with bold decisions and political statements. The Global Stocktake should build high-level political momentum and expectations that parties should start reflecting on how they will step up their ambition in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation as stipulated in the Paris Agreement. This is particularly so for Africa, hence the continent's robust participation in the Global Stocktake process. Africa, we all believe and know, is the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts under all climate scenarios above 1.5 degrees Celsius, despite having contributed the least to global warming. It is therefore in the interest of Africa that the impacts of climate change on the continent and its efforts to address them are duly recognized. The continent's vulnerability is also compounded by the low level of development and the pressing developmental challenges of meeting the basic needs of its young and growing population. Therefore, Africa must effectively present its overriding position of putting development at the forefront of its response to climate change. While the Paris Agreement is a treaty that is applicable to signatory parties only, it has been widely recognized that non-party stakeholders have an important role to play in its implementation. All hands need to be on deck to deliver the Paris Agreement. That is the reason we have put up this event this evening, to showcase the important role that multilateral development banks and UN agencies play in implementing the Paris Agreement while achieving a sustainable future for the developing world. We will explore the contributions of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the African Development Bank, and the UN Capital Development Fund's country-based mechanism, popularly called LOCAL. And we'll also look at their roles, that's the roles of these institutions in supporting developing countries to implement the Paris Agreement and ultimately the Stocktake. We've chosen to focus on adaptation, action, and support, not only because these are priority areas for climate action for our constituencies, but also because more information is needed on progress towards achieving the global goal on adaptation and on climate finance, of which half is to be channeled to adaptation. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anthony NYONG. I'm the Director of the Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank, and I will be moderating this event this evening. So we have here with us a team of very seasoned experts who will present interesting actions that contribute to the goal of the Paris Agreement and ultimately the Stocktake. So please join me to welcome Mr. Gareth PHILLIPS, who is the Manager, Climate and Environment Finance at the African Development Bank. Please come, take your seat. Next, I have Ms. Sophie de Coninck, Manager of the Local Global Facility of the UN Capital Development Fund. Please. And then thirdly, we have Mr. Dimitri Halubuski, who is the Principal Climate Finance and Carbon Markets Officer at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Please join us. Please, can you put your hands together for our panelists? We'll have 2 rounds of questions. The first round, please try to limit your responses to about 5 minutes each. And then you have a second round of questions, after which we will invite representatives of the Africa Group of Negotiators and PACJA to give their perspectives on this. And then we have questions and answers. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that you will need addressed. So please stay with us. Mr. Gareth, you take the first question. What initiatives have been undertaken by your organization, that's the African Development Bank, to enhance adaptation action in developing countries by both the public and the private sector? And what has been their impact so far, including obstacles and barriers? So you may also wish to talk about the adaptation benefit mechanism also. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Tony, thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is Gareth PHILLIPS. I'm the Manager of Climate and Environmental Finance at the African Development Bank. And it's a great pleasure to be here and joined by my colleagues. So I wanted just briefly to address this question. I'll point you first of all to our annual report. Each year, the Climate Change and Green Growth Department produces an annual report. And actually, I see that this is not the correct link. I pasted the wrong one. But anyway, if you Google AfDB Climate Change Annual Report, you'll get our annual report. And there you can see a full list of all the initiatives that we have. But I wanted to highlight 5 particular initiatives that I think are particularly important for our contribution to adaptation and that should be picked up in the Global Stocktake. So the first, and these are roughly in chronological order, the first was in 2017 when our President made a commitment to allocate 40% of the bank's total investment to climate change change, and 50% of that to go towards adaptation. So that really set quite a target in those days. We were the only institution to have adopted a 50% target. And indeed, I think the 40% target was also high amongst the MDBs at the time. And since then, we have managed to exceed that target, both in terms of total percentage. This last year we did 42%, and 63% of that funding went towards adaptation. So that's, I think, quite a very significant contribution towards the Stocktake. Then in 2019, we launched the adaptation benefits mechanism, and it was a pilot phase that we launched on this, and this is to encourage developed countries to balance their investment in adaptation and mitigation, which some of you may know is a commitment in the Paris Agreement. There are a lack of instruments that can be used to channel finance into adaptation, and we think the adaptation benefits mechanism is a tool that can be used to do that, and so we're continuing to develop that. And the important point here is that if we can make the adaptation benefits mechanism work, then it will open the door to allow project developers to access the debt capital markets so that you can fund adaptation projects using capital markets in the same way as we fund many mitigation projects. So it's quite an important initiative. Then in 2021, we launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Programme in partnership with the Global Centre for Adaptation. And with the GCA, we adopted a target to double the total amount of adaptation finance coming to the continent by 2025. Now, there's a lot of 25s here. So the African Development Bank, we have our own target of $25 billion cumulative, and that's 50-50 adaptation mitigation. So then you take our 12.5 billion that we said we would mobilize for adaptation, and we double that again to 25 billion, which is the GCA AAAP target to be achieved by 2025. So I hope I've confused you sufficiently there with all those 25s. But no, seriously, this is a major target, and we're making good progress. I'll update on the progress on that in the second question. Then in 2021, we launched the African Green Banks Initiative, and I highlight this as being very important for adaptation because green banks are national financing institutions that can raise funds in both hard currency and local currency and then lend them in a context-specific manner to local initiatives. And this can be very relevant for providing finance for adaptation. And then finally, the last of our 5 initiatives is the Climate Action Window, launched in 2022, which is under the 16th ADF, Africa Development Fund cycle. And there we've raised $430 million already to contribute towards 75% towards adaptation. Now, some challenges remain. As I mentioned at the start, this challenge of balancing investment in adaptation and mitigation. Currently, it's around about 90% mitigation, 10% adaptation, and we need to see that increasing. We need to create multiple sources of and multiple and diverse sources of finance for adaptation. There are many sources of finance for mitigation. If you go out and look, there are a lot of instruments collecting money and many instruments that offer concessional funding for mitigation projects, but actually very few for adaptation. So we need to change that. And we need to find a way of valuing adaptation because the way it currently stands, it's considered to be a public good. Public goods don't generate revenues and the private sector can't invest in activities that don't generate revenues. So that's a real challenge. In terms of finance provided and planned, from 2020 to 2022, we have mobilized about $8 billion worth of climate finance against our target of $25 billion, and more than 50% of that has been for adaptation. The AAAP has mobilized $3.9 billion towards their $25 billion target. The Climate Action Window already has $429 million with a target of mobilizing $4 billion by 2025. And the other initiatives I mentioned are at the outset. The green banks and the ABM are at the outset. And then in terms of our plans, we continue to increase, we plan to continue to increase the amount of finance mobilized for adaptation and mitigation. From 2023, and this is an important point, all of the bank's activities will be Paris aligned, which means they will be not inconsistent with the long-term strategies, nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans of our host countries. And we will be responding to the Sharm el-Sheikh call to reform the MDBs. And particularly, I want to highlight the ABM, that's the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism, the Climate Action Window, and the Green Banks Initiative as being innovative and transformational initiatives, which, as some of you may recall from the language of the Sharm el-Sheikh Cover Agreement, this is what we are asked to do. We're also pushing the boundaries on balance sheet optimization, looking at ways to improve the way the bank uses its capital. We have a very successful initiative with the UK government called Room to Run, where we've extended a sovereign guarantee to take on some of the bank's lending operations. And we are also working with the insurance sector to develop new insurance products. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Tony. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gareth. A lot of numbers, a lot of 25 billions, and a lot of other billions. Really excited that such money is available and that a lot of it is going to adaptation. So, over to you, Sophie. You're the manager of the local global facility, very innovative program on its own. Could you tell us some of the things you've done, the initiatives undertaken, and how they are performing, challenges and opportunities? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So indeed, my name is Sophie de Coninck. I'm the manager of the local climate adaptive living facility. The UN Capital Development Fund works across a range of financial instruments, geographies, and financial specialties. And today I will focus on that specific flagship initiative because it is the most established initiative in the field of adaptation finance. Now, in terms of challenges, perhaps starting with challenges that we observe rather than the one we might encounter, although they are linked, the IPCC last report flagged to, again, a very high number, 3.3 to 3.6 billion of people living in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. We all know that adaptation is highly localized, to be contextualized, yet observers estimate, because we lack data, that only 10% of climate finance reaches the local level. And when it does so, it's more often through project approaches or parallel systems that are actually using country systems that can be brought to scale. So that's one first challenge. Second, we also observe that we are still largely organized around sectors, around projects, and the IPCC again point to the need for integrated multi-sectoral approach, which all makes sense, especially when it comes to the local level. And a third, perhaps, obstacle we see still this issue of funding, which I mentioned for the local level, but also challenges when it comes to methodologies, risk-informed planning, and then the MRV that goes with it. So in other words, we lack systemic approaches for addressing local adaptation at scale and sustaining those efforts in the long term with the proper MRV system. Now, in terms of opportunities, we nevertheless see opportunities, and one of such opportunities that we see is working through country systems and in particular with local governments. The reason for that is that they are mandated for many climate-sensitive sectors and increasingly for climate change itself by policy, by law in the countries. They are close to the population. They can address the local needs. And so, therefore, we see an opportunity to make use of those country systems because it brings scale. And it is also possible to work with those systems in a way that is, highly tailor-made to the needs of the countries. And also when comes the local the use of the finance in a way that is very much programmed, planned with the local actors. So those are opportunities that we see. And so UNCDF has been working for the last 10 years through this particular initiative. Without going into all the details, essentially what we do and partners with support from some of the partners you saw on the first slide is we do work with communities and local governments. We do work with central level government entities in charge of finance, in charge of climate change, in charge of planning, and also ministries in charge of local governments to help them establish such systems. And so as we do so, we help them define a dedicated climate window as part of their own intergovernmental fiscal transfer systems, however with proven additionality and traceability. The instrument is performance-based, which means that there is ways to verify, guarantee the programming and verification of the use of the finance for local climate expenditures. And we do so through checks of certain access conditions, also use of certain performance measures that can incentivize continuous improvement in how local governments and communities can program climate finance in line with all the requirements of the global funds or partners. So importantly, there is a strong element of capacity building and technical support, which comes through continuous on-the-job learning, but also a key point. Every year there is an annual performance assessment that then inform the needs for support, but also inform the size of the grants. And if you're performing better, you will get a slightly bigger grant or vice versa. So that creates this positive emulation between local governments. Last, just to conclude, to give a sense, because it's talking about the Stocktake, where are the countries? So we've been working on this for the last 10 years. So it has evolved into a multi-country, multi-partner initiative. You see now 34 countries that have asked for this kind of systems for support to put them in place. And since the beginning of the year, there are actually 3 more that should be added to the map, essentially mostly from least developed countries and African nations. So currently 18 countries that are using it actively, 16 that are preparing, and so far 350 local governments and 16 million people. So it's still a drop in the ocean, but we very much see the potential for this to go to scale, and we're not the only one, because we also see movement, if I can put it like that, exploration, scoping from some of the MDBs who have been used to scale up decentralization systems in countries as they are now looking at supporting local adaptation. The reason is also because there are many co-benefits in terms of SDGs, considering the sectors that the local governments and the communities will typically decide to invest in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I think you've raised something quite important. Everyone sees adaptation as very local, too localized. You really can't scale it up, and so on. But with local, it shows that there is opportunity there to actually bring communities together to understand and see what they're doing on adaptation and scale it up. So that's quite interesting. Dimitri, to you, what are those things you're doing? Even if it's on carbon, we need to raise money from the carbon market to be able to implement adaptation. So that's very important.
And that's,
so over to you.
Yeah, definitely the power of the markets is what can really help scale the adaptation work, including the adaptation work, but the climate work in general. And I would probably start first by thanking to the organizers to putting this distinguished panel together to discuss this very important topic. And I would probably start by framing how we perceive the adaptation work in EBRD. EBRD being a primarily private sector focused bank. Over 70% of our business is in the private sector. So there's a certain angle that we have to take in order to address the needs of our clients. And we have come through an approach whereby there's been a development that led us to the eventual conclusion that the Paris Alignment assessment is the key instrument to ensure integration and systemic integration, actually, of climate risk assessment in our investments. And this has, as you see in this this chart, which presents sort of the scopes of climate action that we look at, and you see that the largest of that is the EBRD Paris Alignment assessment, which essentially covers everything. And as Gareth indicated earlier, EBRD similarly has set a target, and as of the beginning of this year, all of our operations are aligned with the objectives of Paris Agreement, including adaptation. And we see that implementation and introduction of the Paris Alignment framework has enabled us to really mainstream the climate adaptation work across our portfolio, and actually mainstream the adaptation thinking across our work. And even this year, as we're seeing, the volume of adaptation finance has already exceeded the full 2022 adaptation finance volume. So there's already some quite significant progress on that. In order to put the kind of the context of adaptation work in a more structured way, EBRD came out with the Climate Adaptation Action Plan, which was launched last year at COP27, which covers sort of three broad areas, from mainstreaming adaptation across our policy and investment work, partnerships and capacity building, and that's where our intention to cooperate as part of the ABM steps in, and also the proactive development of business models and private sector mobilization, which we see as the key. In terms of the EBRD region is slightly kind of, it's different, but it's quite diverse in terms of the various impacts that we're seeing and that the region is facing. According to some analysis, our region is kind of could be considered relatively less exposed than, for example, Africa, but still, we do see already the impacts of climate change taking place from the heat waves from across Central Asia, Turkey, North Africa, to water scarcity, to flooding, and so on. So our investment approach tries to kind of tackle and address all those risks to the extent possible, and we're just exemplifying here a few of the recent cases where we have taken that approach, where essentially we're looking both at the acute but also the chronic hazard that are faced by our clients. In terms of the numbers, you can see here that across over the past decade, EBRD has invested over $3 billion across the different sectors in the adaptation finance, and you see the bulk of the adaptation finance comes in three regions: Central Asia, CEMED, which is for us the North Africa and Mediterranean, and Eastern Europe and Balkans. And that's also more or less matches with the key hotspots in terms of the impacts that we're seeing. The sectoral breakdown also kind of is indicative in terms of where the priority interventions are being placed. You have the municipal infrastructure, transport, and energy as the key areas where we definitely see the impacts to be generated. And I would probably like to flag a few of the specific examples which are also indicated there. We do see the value in mobilizing donor climate finance that has been instrumental in taking several initiatives forward, including, for instance, our Morocco conservation project, which is a joint intervention with the Green Climate Fund, which looks at the sustainable irrigation infrastructure. We have just recently launched a joint effort with IFC in Egypt on seawater desalination to address the water issues in Egypt. And we're also looking at a municipal level, municipal scale, where the infrastructure requirements may be a bit of a lesser concern. For instance, we just recently signed a project in Moldova and to help address the flooding risk in the capital city of Chisinau, which is also supported by Green Climate Fund. So those are just a few kind of elements which I wanted to flag. Happy to take the questions, if any. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dimitri. There was a time people would think that climate change impacts are basically restricted to developing countries. Not really. You see a lot of floodings. I think last month it was Italy somewhere that were now Moldova and so on. So this affects everybody, and it's important that we build that resilience and adaptation. Having said that, Gareth, we know that many institutions, organizations are struggling in allocating sufficient resources to adaptation. The UN Secretary General has called for a 50-50 parity, and many are struggling with it. And I know that the African Development Bank has been able to meet, like you've said, and exceed that. So what are some of those best practices that you could share that have enabled the African Development Bank to get to that level of funding for adaptation?
Thank you very much for the question, Tony. And just before I go into my answer to that, I think it is very interesting to recognise the impact or the need for adaptation and the impact of climate change in developed countries. The difference is that in developed countries, you have an insurance policy. You have an insurance policy for your house if it gets flooded. If you live in a house that is then prone to flooding, you find yourself in a real problem and you can get into a negative equity situation because nobody wants to buy your house because it's prone to flooding and you can't get an insurance policy on it. In Africa and in most developing countries, we don't have the insurance policies there in the first place. So individuals have to bear those costs. And I think that's a really big contrast between how we cope with adaptation in these two different circumstances. So let's start with the best practices. I'm going to highlight one best practice, and Dimitri also talked about it. Paris alignment. I think this is going to become sort of the best practice element. So what do we mean by Paris alignment? And for those of you who have been following the MDBs and our road towards Paris alignment, you'll know that I think back in, I think it was 2018 in Poland, we published our 6 building blocks, and we said we would present guidelines on this. It's been a very long road. We finally have our high-level principles for aligning with what we call building blocks 1 and 2, which is how we assess projects and investments, in fact, not projects, for how we assess investments for their alignment with the adaptation and mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think they are hopefully going to be published very soon. And Dimitri's smiling because EBRD have been handling that, but possibly even at the the Macron-Motley summit coming up if we can all finally agree. But anyway, those high-level principles will explain how we're going about addressing the issue of ensuring that our investments are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And that's very important because what it really means is that we will be able to demonstrate that everything that we are doing is either contributing to or not impacting upon the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's important to draw the distinction between that and the concept of climate finance, which we also talk about, and we report on climate finance because that's what's used to count up towards this $100 billion target and will contribute to the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. But the two are different, and we won't go into the details, but there are some activities that will be considered Paris aligned that are actually not part of the climate finance activities. So best practice would be to put in place procedures to ensure that all investments are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And of course that then leads to Article 2.1c, pushing towards the fact that all financial activities are aligned. So then in terms of some lessons learned, I think, again, I picked out 5 that I wanted to highlight. First of all, this need to balance investment in adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation is really quite easy to invest in because most mitigation projects, the majority of them are in the energy sector. And of course, they come with revenues. So it's very easy to construct a financial model that enables you to borrow debt and repay that from the revenues that come from the sale of energy or from energy efficiency savings and so on. That's not the case with adaptation because at the moment we don't value it. It's a public good. It's very difficult to make money out of planting mangroves, and yet we know that it's critically important to communities that live in coastal areas to protect the coastline, to stop saltwater inundation, to provide hatcheries for fisheries and so on. So we need to find ways to do that. We need to improve channels to access or to channel funding towards adaptation activities, and particularly in LDCs and SIDS. And I want to highlight here the climate action window that we created at the African Development Bank. The motivation behind that actually came from COP26, where a number of governments committed to double or even treble their contribution to adaptation finance. And again, we get quite technical here, but when donors give money to the African Development Fund, they can count, or they have their own rules, but most of them count 40% of their contribution as climate finance. So if they give $100 million, they only get to say they've contributed $40 million towards climate finance. Through the climate action window, we've now created a tool that allows them to say, we've contributed 100% of this finance to climate action, and actually if they tag it, if they earmark it, then they can say it's 100% towards adaptation. So that's really important, and it's a way that donors can significantly step up their contribution towards adaptation finance. Thirdly, we need to provide a means for private sector to engage in adaptation. This comes back to this challenge that I mentioned about most private sector activities sort of being directed towards mitigation rather than adaptation. And that's where we're going now with the adaptation benefits mechanism, trying to provide a way of paying the private sector project developers to invest into adaptation by creating what we call certified adaptation benefits, and then putting a price on those and inviting developed countries and corporates and consumers and philanthropies to purchase those adaptation benefits. And in doing so, they provide a cash flow to the projects that then make those projects financially viable. The fourth lesson that we learned was about the need to mobilize funds and lend in hard and soft currencies or local currencies. Even when you do a mitigation project, you collect your revenues in the local currency. And if that's a currency that suffers from exchange rate fluctuations, then that's a real problem to finance. It's really expensive to take a hedging instrument. It makes it very difficult to make those projects financially viable. And it's a real disincentive for investment in both adaptation and mitigation. So we need to, we've learned that we need to solve those problems, and green banks is a solution that can address that. And finally, the last lesson we've learned is about small-scale, context-specific activities. The nature of adaptation action is mostly small-scale and context-specific, and Sophie talked about that in the work that they do in Locale, and I think it's a really good example of how you can find ways to finance these activities and how important they are. And I want to add to that as well that we can use these instruments to address entities that are typically unbankable. There are, and I can't remember, we did a study at the African Development Bank, and I think it showed that something like 75 or 80% of women in Africa are unbankable. They cannot access credit. Youth cannot access credit. And we need to find ways, and I think sort of the small-scale, context-specific financing instruments offer opportunities to enable those people who are unbankable and who can't get involved in projects to overcome that barrier. Briefly on methodologies and metrics. So very interestingly, the adaptation benefits mechanism is developing methodologies that help us define what adaptation is in these different context-specific examples. And we're coming up with ways to measure outcomes and outputs and outcomes that lead to the impacts that we want to see in the long term. And that's very important, because if we can identify outcomes and that lead to impacts, then we can measure and report those outcomes, and we can say we're highly confident that these outcomes are going to give us the impacts that we want in 10 years' time. But we don't have to wait 10 years to see those. We don't have to wait to pay for those. And that enables us to accelerate and speed up the rate at which we finance projects. And on metrics, I think this is a very interesting area as well. A lot of work has been done around sort of looking for an adaptation metric, but really, metrics and adaptation is what the host countries say it is in their NDCs and their NAPs. That's an opportunity for countries to say, these are our adaptation needs. We need to be able to measure those and report them in a transparent manner so that we know what we're paying for. But we don't need to try and resolve that down just into one or two metrics. We can have lots of different adaptation metrics that are suited to the technologies and the solutions that are being provided. And we shouldn't be shy of that. Yes, it'll make the reporting matrices a little bit more complicated, but we don't need to try to focus on just one or two metrics. And my final point is that I want to highlight how important the contribution of the MDBs, and I should also say the UN agencies, is to the global stocktake, how significant this is, because these are the institutions where the work is really taking place on the ground. We're doing things, we're putting money to work, we're developing initiatives, and we're breaking new ground and showing how initiatives can solve some of these problems. And so it's really important that the global stocktake picks up on these activities and reports them at COP28. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gareth. You've raised quite important issues. There are challenges, yes, Sophie has mentioned them, and they're also best practices. And so talking about best practices, Sophie, what can we learn?
Thank you.
From what has worked?
Perhaps a few lessons that we would like to share. So indeed, I mean, you've seen from the first part of the experience sharing that countries now have experience. They have a track record in actually using their systems and actually channel different source of finance in a system, still being compliant to the source of finance, be it a project from a bilateral donor or in the future also as they access, climate funds increasingly. So at this point, the collective experience is 10, 12 years from Asia, Africa, now expanding in the Pacific and next in the Caribbean. And perhaps at this point, there's been $100 million or so channeled through these systems, and we see that it's growing at perhaps 30% or so each year. So the demand is big, and the track record will only accumulate. So that's important. Now, what's good is that not only have the countries a track record, but they've worked together to actually document it. So over the last 2-3 years, they worked together to actually develop an ISO standard, which you can Google, ISO 14093, on this performance-based grant system. And so it means that there is a reference quality assurance a point for countries to continue this, but also to increase the confidence of the financiers, also the ministries of finance as they start co-financing this type of work, and the climate funds, that there will be a quality process and that the adaptation results will be produced. So this ISO standard actually was already derived from a set of guidelines that the countries had prepared with our support and presented to the LDC expert group, to the UNFCCC. So that was already the case, and it's a way, it's presented as a way to really ensure the vertical integration of the NDC or the NAP. So we see really the whole chain from the very underground experience to this, methodologies, and then to the global policy agenda and also climate finance. It's important because there is a need for diversifying the source of climate finance and also to sequence them, because we know that it takes more than a project for a community to become resilient, and so it's very much a long-term endeavor. And it is possible to achieve economies of scale by building on a system and federating efforts. Now, in terms of the work stream that somehow have been presented as part of the Global Stocktake and how this local mechanism, it really offers a methodological process to promote transformational adaptation in very different contexts, from Bhutan to Africa to Pacific, very different contexts, but similar work stream in terms of sensitization, capacity building of the local communities, of the local governments, and of the central level agency that will oversee this kind of systemic mechanism. Second, working through own planning and develop and budgeting processes instead of applying to call for proposals. So it's a way to strengthen the daily operations, daily business of those local actors, so that it also influences how they will use other forms of resources, which in turn might well eventually qualify for being climate finance as such. And in terms of monitoring, evaluation, or reporting and verification as well, we have worked with the World Resource Institute to develop a methodology whereby each investment, all these small-scale investment, currently 2,000 investment across countries, is justified with a small adaptation rationale. So how does it speak to the local risks? How does it speak to the local adaptation priorities? What is the rationale? And linked to that, what are those outcome indicators, output indicators that eventually allow this monitoring and reporting really synced with the NDC and the NAP? So it is possible to have very contextualized local adaptation response and then aggregate and report that at the national and global level. So that is important so that this work can continue and importantly go to scale. And the countries are very much working to actually inform the global policy agenda. So they participate through side events, submissions, importantly, and it ranges from the Global Goal on Adaptation, the Durban Forum on Capacity Building, the LDC expert group, considering we work with many LDC countries, and recently also the Africa group of negotiators and the LDC group have presented a number of non-market approaches, ABM being one, but also local being one, as they see it as a way to also operationalize Article 6.8. So it is important, again, to see this link from the very localized responses to how we can somehow influence the policy setup so that the goal is always to accelerate this adaptation in an effective manner. So I will conclude with this, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. One of the main challenges we've always had is that people say, what is adaptation? What are the metrics? How do you measure? And it varies from place to place. And because even the development of the NDCs, when you talk with most of the people, you realize that those NDCs were not generated from the bottom up. And so it became difficult to see the contributions of this. But one other thing that might be interesting is how would adaptation metrics, for instance, in the developed world differ from what the smallholder farmer in Burundi calls adaptation? So, Dimitri, what are the lessons, that we've learned, the best practices that we think we should be looking at? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. It's a very challenging question in itself, and I'll try to unpack it a bit. And I would like to start by echoing a bit what Gareth just indicated in terms of the Paris Alignment approach that MDBs have been spearheading to make sure that oral investments are aligned or not undermining basically the efforts of the countries to achieve their NDCs. And where we see essentially the link between the Paris Alignment assessment and then the climate finance, and in particular adaptation finances, these seem to be even though these are distinct elements and these are distinct processes and distinct accounting frameworks, but they're being kind of intertwined and interlinked. And then the way, at least the way we see it, is that Paris Alignment assessment allows us to uncover those critical risks, critical climate risks that the clients are exposed to, be it a private a corporate or even or municipality or particular infrastructure, and then use the climate adaptation for climate finance angle to bringing the necessary capital to address those risks and to thereby ensuring that the investment is then aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So that's the approach that we've been trying kind of to see. And we're of the opinion that seems to be at least the best practice also to refer to what Gareth was saying in terms of how MDBs, at least at the EBRD level, are looking at this. In terms of some lessons, or I'll probably try to also present this a bit in the context of challenges, because definitely the whole the scope of the issues that need to be tackled when we try to scale climate adaptation action is very diverse. It's very context specific, and one of the elements that we see, or one of the critical aspects, is the nature of the adaptation action is very context dependent, and it requires very detailed analysis and modeling. And even though some of the models that even the models that we apply are based basically on forecasts of those risks, which either materialize or not, and then our actions that we're putting in place may not necessarily kind of eventually. There's a risk that those impacts that we're projecting will not materialize, or the systems might change to either to the better or to the worse by the time when the action comes to play. So all those elements need to be built into the structuring of the actions, of the investments that we do. The projects are very complex, which is also basically a function of local context. The access to concessional finance is a critical element, and there we definitely see the benefit of being able to access sort of on pre-agreed terms and predefined timeframes. Resources from the likes of Green Climate Fund, and others. There has to be, and we definitely appreciate a commercial driver for those investments. But for the majority of our clients, which are in the private sector, being aware and taking proactive approach to addressing those climate risks is basically a business choice. If they do not do that, then they're basically out of the business. The materiality of the climate risk is very high, so they are also quite keen on being driven or being driven in the right direction, and we see the potential, for instance, for some of those companies which rely on heavy infrastructure equipment, which is ending their useful lifetime. It's definitely more beneficial for these kind of companies to look into the more resilient equipment and processes rather than trying to rely on the retrofitting the existing ones. We definitely appreciate the benefits of technical cooperation, technical assistance, both and also building the capacities both internally in the bank, whereby we have a program of kind of knowledge sharing and capacity building, so all our bankers are brought up to speed and they can help support the clients, but also the technical assistance that we provide directly to the clients, including to look at their processes, at their business models, and see what risks are most acute to them and how they can be addressed in the most efficient way. Crowding in of private sector players, private sector finance and capital markets is critical here. And ABM, the adaptation benefits mechanism that AfDB has been piloting, is really breaking ground here in this space, and EBRD is also considering the potential of joining the effort at some point. We're exploring the different modalities. We also appreciate the potential that such capital market financial instruments as sustainable linked loans and bonds have in terms of driving private finance. EBRD has issued a adaptation bond, resilience bond several years ago, which was oversubscribed, and we do see that as a potential additional instrument to finance adaptation work. In terms of the metrics, so EBRD has been largely focusing on these 6 outcomes, resilient outcomes that we basically track: availability and increased availability of energy, water resources, agricultural productivity, health, weather-related disruptions, and so on. However, even those outcomes, as I already indicated, may not necessarily capture the whole depth of the impacts that we're looking into, and would also see the benefit of aligning our work with what others are doing, and in this context, jointly with other MDBs as part of the MDB Working Group on Climate Action, and specifically the Climate Adaptation Working Group, we're looking into potential for coming up with some at least common principles, I guess, to start with, for adaptation metrics, which will then help us be more or less on the same board with other MDBs and be communicating consistently across the impacts that we're delivering. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. You've also raised quite important issues about metrics. If you can't measure it, I'm not sure you can actually do anything about it. And I know that the global goal on adaptation is also developing metrics, and it will be important that we all sit and form part of one conversation. Growing up, I was told that at least 75% of the resources needed to address climate change will come from the private sector, and maybe 25% from the public sector. We are struggling with that 75% from the private sector, and that's why I also like the adaptation benefit mechanism, that just like mitigation, you can actually quantify, what it is you're paying for, what you're buying. For mitigation, it's easy. 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2. You know what it is you're buying. So I think this will go a long way in trying to bring the adaptation community together to at least agree on what is generatable and sellable. Thank you very much. Now I have the representatives of the Africa Group of Negotiators, and PACJA, who is in here first. There we go. Anyone from PACJA? Okay, behind there. Big boss, you're hiding behind.
So, thank you very much. My name is Mithika from Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. This is a very captivating panel. My point, I'll just have general comment in terms of the issues of climate finance particularly, and when it comes especially to adaptation. I'll not mention individuals, but the point here, we have been struggling at global level with the issue of climate finance, and particularly adaptation. And we fought. We were part of the civil society organizations which were vehemently opposed to the World Bank and they called for the establishment of another multilateral finance institution which came to be known as the Green Climate Fund. And what we wanted in that fund, away from the World Bank, was to, a fund which was to be easily accessible, which was democratic, and which funding would be over and beyond official development assistance, ODA. But now it was established in Cancun. Many years later, the Green Climate Fund has become even worse than the World Bank, which we were running away. In fact, we are even calling for its abolishment or a total reform because it has failed to meet our expectations. Now, so here, we have really listening to you. We have really still struggling with the issue of climate finance because what the bank, the GCF tells us, even when the communities is you have to explain the climate rationale. And so that's what I was listening to you. So what is this called, you know, you have really to explain so that to define what you want, whether it is adaptation, whether it is mitigation. So what semantics are these? We need what we understand what we want, and you don't need really a lot of explanation to support and fund a climate adaptation project. And so what I'm hearing across again is, you know, the banks have their own way of making things complex so that they are unachievable. So they bring a lot of, you know, terminologies and what. Can we make these things simple for the communities really to afford so that to get support? And we belong to the community of practice now, which is really defining the global, you know, response to particularly adaptation, which is the locally led climate action. So I would urge, and I know even AfDB and the partners there, the local and the other UN, because I've never heard about it again, I'm just hearing about, is it UN Capital Fund? Yes. So are you part of that, or are you intending, because that actually brings all those metrics you are talking about before we wait for the UNFCCC to add another complication and the complex terminologies under GNGA that they are going to have metrics. Metrics are already there, and we need to look into that. Then secondly, is about the issue of adaptation. Indeed, adaptation, why it is not attractive to investment. Why even the global Stocktake right now is more mitigation-centric is because, first of all, the disadvantage we have in the developing countries, particularly from Africa, is the power of conviction. We are not able, so it is shaped within the metrics, within the definition of the North. And because renewable energies and broadly mitigation as returns, as return on investment, apart from the adaptation. And so, when the AfDB, for instance, is having these projects, so are you looking for investment? So how are you going to ensure that we have adaptation have return on investment so that we can have it more invested. I believe that there is return on investment on adaptation. And finally, is just for our wish that there should be balance. This balance, and if you look at because we are in Africa and we understand, we even witness these things, there are a lot of innovations, whether it is adaptation, whether it is the key sectors, and many countries in their NDCs identify critical sectors like agriculture, like transport, like water, like waste management, and all these have components of adaptation. So what we lack is resources, and clearly the many innovative initiatives like AAAP at AfDB really have demonstrated that we can invest in adaptation and you can make money. So what is needed is really political support and investment more and putting more money on adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michika. First message, keep it simple. We take that. Somebody once said, look, my grandmother did cultivation, agriculture. She didn't divide one part to mitigation and then the other part to adaptation. She just did what needed to be done. We went to the university and came up with mitigation and adaptation and so on. But I get your message. We'll keep it simple. And we also need to get the practitioners to be the ones to actually begin to generate these indices because we'll know what works and what doesn't. AGN.
Thank you,
Mr. Safo.
Tony. Yeah. I've been with the African Group of Negotiators for almost 15 years, 13 years with support of the bank for me to give them advice on legal issues. But there are certain observations I have made over the years. There are a number of funds that have been created under the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. But Africa has lagged behind in assessing these funds that are available, even on a grant basis. Gareth has given us an indication of the amount of funds available to the African Development Bank. And I think it's quite impressive. But how is this communicated to member countries that these funds are available? And secondly, how do you convince them? I know it's not your duty to convince them. People go to the bank because they need your services and they need to invest. But, well, due to the economic condition of our countries, how do you help them to understand that investing in climate change, in adaptation, for which we are the most vulnerable, is profitable? Is there any way that the bank is communicating and helping them to enhance their capacity to assess your funds? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very pointed, and I take that seriously because I'm very certain that many African countries don't even know what we do at the bank. If I ask somebody here, which country are you from? Tell me that you have ever stepped in the African Development Bank office in your country. You'll be amazed that many people haven't. And so it becomes quite difficult that these resources are there. So we encourage people as much as we can to visit our offices in your countries, and then we take it from there. So thank you so very much, AG and Pagja. Questions from the audience? It's not every time you have these three veterans sitting together. So this is the time to ask your question. You can ask. Questions, comments?
Hello, David Hebert Coleman from the Stockholm International Water Institute. So 90% mitigation, 10% adaptation. There's obviously a need to shift. I've been looking at a lot of the NDCs and looking at their water components. And one of the things that you get struck when you read the adaptation components around water is a lack of tangible measures. And I was struck by something that Gareth sort of mentioned, that there's a need to know where we are now and where we want to get to, and this is why we're investing into this adaptation exercise. How do we help support improvements in the NDC processes so that these measures are more tangible, so that you can actually utilise them to understand where you are now to compare to where you want to get to as a result of investment? Because this is something that the water sector is struggling with as a general rule. But going back, it has to be determined locally what that improvement is. But if there's a lack of that tangible aspect within the NDCs, it's hard to determine. Many of the measures are quite generic that you find around adaptation. It's very difficult to sort of measure them. So, have you got any thoughts on that?
I think that's a very serious observation. Thank you very much, because we've always said in Africa, climate change is water. Too much of it, we flood. Too little of it, drought. It's water. So if we are struggling with being able to measure, to quantify what those risks and opportunities are, then there is an issue. I'm sure they'll be able to provide guidance. Funsho, you have your hand up.
Good, thank you. Funsho Marine, African Development Bank, Nairobi office. Sophie, I want to direct this question to you, and given the fact that you've got experience on the ground, from the work that you've done in all of this country, could you tell us how adaptation is framed? Because there's power in framing. How you frame a concept on an issue could determine to a large extent how you allocate value to it. And so, is it framed as a cost or is it framed as an investment? It would be good to hear your thought about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is NDC a sunk cost or an investment opportunity? That's the question. Okay? Any other question? One more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Bernard Kofi. I'm from ECOWAS Commission, Economic Community of West African State. I'm sorry I came late, but I noted something which is very important regarding the policies. In particular, adaptation policies, which can trigger the financing from the bank. In a response to policy as intergovernmental body, ECOWAS has developed a regional climate strategy. And this strategy is the main driver to strengthen the capacity of the 15 member states. Within the implementation of this strategy, we plan to harmonize the policies, the regulation across the member states. How? And we have set up a donor group. How a bank can be part of the donor group to support a regional body to assist its member state to set up the enabling condition for the bank to invest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we support regional entities? Yes, we do. I guess the panelists will answer more. So Gareth, quickly, we are almost running out of time. pick
Okay,
the
let
questions you
me
want to.
respond firstly to David on the question of the water component. So, I mean, I think that you need to start even further back with the long-term strategy, and we don't have many long-term strategies in Africa. But ideally, a long-term strategy would set out a goal that says, and I'm just, you know, for example, 100% of the population with year-round access to potable water and 100% of wastewater collected and treated. So, you know, those are your two major goals as to what you get to. And then you would use the nationally determined contribution or perhaps the National Adaptation Plan to outline your 5 yearly steps towards that long-term goal. And I think that, you know, with that kind of a framework, then you have a structure that can help you define where you need to go. But what we want, and particularly in terms of the looking at the adaptation benefits mechanism, we would like to see really specific goals there that say, you know, there are 5,000 villages that need to have access to potable water by 2030 in order to ensure that they can continue living there and to reduce, you know, all the negative impacts associated with the climate change. And if you had a specific target like that, then the adaptation benefits mechanism is designed to enable a donor or a corporate or a philanthropy in the developed world to say, okay, I want to support those villages with that. I'm doing lots of other stuff around mitigation, so on, but actually I also want to do something on adaptation. So I will purchase adaptation benefits associated with those projects that will make that project attractive to the private sector. And then you'll get a private sector developer who will come in and say, okay, on the basis of that, I'll be able to develop this water infrastructure that will become sustainable and operational for the communities. So that's the kind of how I would respond to that. And let me just respond briefly to Kofi's question from ECOWAS. Then indeed, as Tony said, you know, as a bank, we can support regional bodies. We have a number of funds that provide technical assistance for these kinds of activities. I mean, there isn't a huge amount of money in them, but there are opportunities to access support to provide this kind of, in this case, this example of harmonizing activities. And it's not a new or a unique idea. We have a similar question coming from one of our major donors saying, how can we harmonize across different funds? Because we have people accessing funds and they've got to do this kind of ESIA and gender analysis for this fund, but they've got to do it different. The climate rationale for this fund is different from the climate rationale for that fund. If we could harmonize across these things, then it would be so much easier and so much more efficient. And I think it's this, you're the other side of the coin. If you can harmonize the policies that we have in countries, then it can definitely help us to make these things much easier, much smoother, and more cost efficient and effective. Thank you.
So, Sophie, I'm sure that in your locale, you come across water, adaptation in the water space. Can you pick the question on water, what needs to be done?
Thank you. In terms of, I mean, the local mechanism is positioned on somehow addressing also these principles for locally led adaptation. So it is typically part of the type of investment that local government and communities can decide to invest. And as a matter of fact, across Africa, we see as the first, which is not a surprise, the two first priority sectors are agriculture and water. That's where, you know, the bulk of the investment come from. But it is perhaps linking to the question or comment from a colleague from PACJA. It is to be indeed contextualized. And so depending on the risks and the priorities, one might decide to work on that this year and something else next year. And the mini rationale, if I put it like that, is actually form at the time of planning, form of justification of why that investment, for which risk and for which local adaptation priority. So I think in that sense, it's remains simple, but it's also addressing, you know, the kind of need for then documenting, reporting. Thank you.
Thank you. Dimitri, one last word. Do you see climate action as an investment or money thrown away?
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point to finish, I think, our discussion. It's from our perspective, we definitely see it as an opportunity for investment, and that's also the way that our clients and in the private sector, but also in the corporates and municipalities view this, without looking into critically into the issues that they're facing, and then taking a proactive approach to address them. They're not going to be able to continue their business. And also the communities, they face the challenges which are, to provide the opportunity to deal with those challenges through the intervention that banks like MTBs can finance. So definitely that's a way to go for the opportunities in this space.
Okay. Thank you very much. I personally also see these as opportunities. We talk so much as if it's a sunk cost. When the NDC says they want to put solar panels on roofs to generate 1.3 gigawatts of energy, it has a business opportunity. It's investors that will do it, not the government. So I think we need to switch that over and begin to cast climate change as opportunities, because indeed there are. And because we talk so much about gloom, doom, the private sector runs away because they don't want to get in there. They don't understand this risk we're talking about. So, can we put our hands together for the panelists? Thank you so very much. I'm not going to try to summarize that. I'm not sure my head can take that. But key messages have come out. One is that the Stocktake and whatever needs to be done to implement the Paris Agreement cannot be done by a single individual or institution. We need partnerships. We need to work together. Everybody needs to put their hands together on the deck. And the MDBs and the UN agencies, though they are not signatories to the Paris Agreement, have an important role to play there. And that in this Stocktake, the works that such institutions are doing should be taken on board. But we also hear the charge that we've been given. How can we make countries aware of the resources that we have, either in the MDBs? Local has been around for more than 10 years about that, and my colleague is just hearing of it now. How do we make these institutions available and these opportunities available to the people that need them the most? And what is it that we would want to see in the Stocktake, that the works and the activities by institutions and agencies outside government, the non-state actors or the non-party actors, should also be taken on board? We've seen mechanisms, we've seen climate finance opportunities, we've heard the millions, we've heard the billions. We want to see them. Somebody once said, you guys in MDBs, we talk about monies you've earmarked, that she doesn't want to hear of it, she wants to see, so let's earmark it and not earmark. So I think on that note, I want to say thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.